In the dead of night, a lantern swings above a rocky shore. Waves crash against jagged cliffs, and hidden in the shadows lies something far more dangerous than a ship armed with cannons. A stronghold? A pirate base. Not just a shelter from storms, but a fortress where stolen treasures were stored, alliances forged, and bloody betrayals carried out. These strongholds were the beating heart of piracy. They were where empires feared to go, where outlaw kingdoms rose, and where, just as quickly, they fell. And the story of how pirates built and lost these strongholds is darker, stranger, and more surprising than you might imagine. Before we dive into this forgotten world, take a moment to subscribe and like the video. It helps us uncover more hidden corners of history and bring them to you. Now, let's set sail back in time. Picture the Caribbean in the late 1600s. The region is carved up by European empires, but the map is still unstable, with vast stretches of coastlines untouched by forts or garrisons. For pirates, this was opportunity. They weren't just raiding ships. They were carving out spaces to exist beyond the law. And they did it by creating strongholds. But a pirate stronghold was not a neat stone fortress with polished cannons facing the sea. No, these were wild, improvised places that balanced chaos and cunning. They had to be invisible yet intimidating, secure but temporary, thriving hubs that could vanish almost overnight. Take Port Royal in Jamaica, for example. In the 17th century, was more than just a town. It was the most notorious pirate stronghold in the New World. Some called it the wickedest city on earth. Pirates poured in from across the Atlantic, filling its taverns with drunken laughter, bloody brawls, and whispers of treasure. Ships arrived in harbor loaded with stolen silver and spices, and merchants who were just as greedy as the pirates welcomed them with open arms. But what made Port Royal so powerful wasn't just its location or wealth. It was the sense of protection. Behind its reputation of lawlessness was a political truth. England quietly supported piracy. So long as the loot flowed back into the empire, Port Royal thrived because it was tolerated. But not all strongholds were like that. Many were hidden away, carved into remote islands, far from the reach of kings and governors. Tortuga, for instance, the very name still carries an echo of mystery. It wasn't built as a great city, it was a rough island, a rock in the sea. But its bays offered safe anchorage, and its caves offered hiding places. Pirates transformed it into a nest of survival. They built makeshift huts, storage pits for rum and gunpowder, and alliances with outcasts who lived there. For a while, Tortuga was a place where pirates ruled themselves, free from empire. But with freedom came instability. One day, it was a haven. The next, it was under siege by a European fleet. Strongholds like this were always living on borrowed time. And so where the story gets interesting. The way pirates built their strongholds was never just about wood, stone, or cannons. It was about people. These bases thrived only as long as the fragile balance of trust, fear, and greed held together. In Port Royal, merchants needed pirates, and pirates needed merchants. In Tortuga, survival meant uniting desperate men under a flag of convenience. But once that balance shifted, when empires grew tired of looking away, or when greed split captains apart, those strongholds crumbled. One of the strangest truths about pirate bases is that they were never permanent. They weren't cities built for centuries. They were fires that burned bright and fast. Nassau, in the Bahamas, is perhaps the best example of this. At its height, Nassau was a pirate republic, a place where more than 1,000 outlaws ruled the island with no king, no governor, and no master. Captains gathered there to divide spoils, recruit crews, and plan attacks on shipping lanes. But what kept Nassau alive wasn't walls or Fort Sitt, was unity. For a brief time, pirates turned it into a self-governing experiment. A place where decisions were made collectively, where stolen wealth was shared, and where they dared to imagine a world outside the grip of empires. And yet, that dream was fragile. the British Crown could not tolerate it forever. Once commerce was threatened and pressure from merchants grew, warships arrived. Nassau, like so many pirate strongholds, collapsed in fire and blood. But why did these strongholds vanish so icily? The answer lies in the very nature of piracy. Pirates were brilliant at striking quickly and disappearing into the sea. But a stronghold required roots walls, farms, trade, families, and pirates were not patient farmers. They thrived on motion, on freedom. A base could grow, but only until it demanded stability. And stability was poison to the pirate life. Still, while they lasted, these bases were worlds of their own. Inside a stronghold, rules were rewritten. A sailor who had once been flogged and starved aboard a Navy ship could find himself treated as an equal. His vote counted in decisions. Outcasts, escaped slaves, and adventurers could join the ranks, carving out a life where they were no longer property, but free men. That is what made pirate strongholds so dangerous, not just their cannons or ships, but the radical idea of freedom they represented. Yet freedom also carried a shadow. In places like Port Royal, excess spiraled out of control. Drunkenness, gambling, duels, and betrayals filled the streets. When an earthquake struck Jamaica in 1692, it swallowed much of Port Royal into the sea. For the world, it looked like divine punishment, a judgment on the wickedest city on earth. For pirates, it was a brutal reminder. Even the strongest strongholds could vanish in a heartbeat. The cycle repeated across the seas. Madagascar, far away on the other side of the world, became a base for Indian Ocean pirates. It was a place of dreams, lush, distant, impossible for European powers to easily control. Pirates envisioned it as a free kingdom, a land where they could trade with locals, settle down, and build something lasting. But dreams collided with reality. Disease, mistrust, and isolation gnawed at the settlement. What was supposed to be a utopia quickly descended into a graveyard. Every stronghold carried the same paradox. Pirates built them because they needed safety, but by staying too long, they became vulnerable. They wanted freedom, but freedom demanded unity, and unity demanded compromise. And compromise was not a pirate's strength. The fall of these bases wasn't always caused by cannon fire. Sometimes it was betrayal. A governor bribed to turn against his allies, a captain tempted by pardon and gold. A single trader could collapse the fragile ecosystem of a pirate nest. Imagine the terror of waking up in Nassau to see the sails of British warships on the horizon, knowing that someone had tipped them off and that the pirate republic was about to burn. Still, we can't underestimate the ingenuity pirates showed in building these strongholds. They knew how to pick their ground-hidden coves, narrow inlets, shallow waters where heavy Navy ships couldn't follow. They built watchtowers from driftwood, dug tunnels into cliffs, set traps along jungle paths. They improvised, turning scraps into defenses. A pirate stronghold wasn't about stone walls, was about turning nature itself into a fortress. And yet, the very sea that gave them life often betrayed them. Storms could rip apart fleets in harbor. Hurricanes could erase entire outposts. For pirates who lived by the ocean was both ally and executioner. If you think about it, pirate strongholds weren't just places on a map, they were symbols. Symbols of defiance, of rebellion, of fleeting freedom. They stood as proof that men could challenge kings and empires, even if only for a season. But they also serve as reminders that such defiance comes at a cost. By the early 18th century, the age of great pirate strongholds was ending. Empires had grown stronger, their navies more ruthless. Governors once friendly to pirates were replaced by men determined to crush them. Amnesty was offered to those who surrendered, and the gallows awaited those who refused. One by one, the lights of those outlaw havens went dark. Tortuga, Port Royal, Nassau, Madagascar, they all fell. What remained were stories, legends, and ruins swallowed by time. And here lies the hidden truth. pirate strongholds were never meant to last forever. They were sparks in the dark, brief moments when the world turned upside down and outlaws held the power. But like sparks, they burned brightly, then disappeared, leaving only smoke and memory. The fall of pirate strongholds might sound inevitable, but the truth is, many of them fell not because they were weak, but because they became too strong. They grew bold enough to threaten the very lifeblood of the empire's trade. As long as pirates harassed only rival nations, they could be tolerated, even quietly supported. But once their strongholds turned into thriving, independent hubs that disrupted everyone's commerce, they crossed a line. That is when the world's most powerful navies came knocking. Take Nassau once again. In its prime, it wasn't just a refuge. It was a buzzing market of stolen goods. Spanish silver, French wine, English cloth, all of it poured into Nassau. Merchants, smugglers, even legitimate traders would sneak in to do business. Ships left Nassau carrying stolen sugar and gold, selling it to whoever had coin. The result? Entire trade routes became unstable. Insurance costs skyrocketed. Merchants began begging their governments to act. And when commerce cries out, empires always listen. The British eventually sent Woodes Rogers, a man with a mission: wipe out the pirate republic. Rogers arrived with soldiers, supplies, and something even more dangerous: pardons. To a pirate tired of running, exhausted from battles and disease, the promise of royal forgiveness was tempting. Rogers broke Nassau not with cannons alone, but with paper. One by one, captains who once swore they'd never bow surrendered for a chance at peace. And those who didn't, they were hunted down, executed, or forced into exile. Nassau collapsed, not with an explosion, but with a slow suffocation of its spirit. It raises a question: could a pirate stronghold ever have survived? Could one of these outlaw havens have transformed into a lasting city-state, something like Venice or Singapore? On paper, maybe. They had the ships, the trade networks, the manpower. But what they lacked was stability. Pirates lived on risk and reward. Their loyalty shifted with the wind. One day, you might share rum with a fellow captain. The next, he might cut your throat for a chest of silver. A stronghold built on mistrust cannot last. But for all their fragility, these places left behind something extraordinary: a vision of what freedom looked like, however chaotic. In Nassau, ordinary sailors had a voice in decisions. In Tortuga, men of every background lived side by side, creating strange, multicultural communities. In Madagascar, pirates married into local tribes, creating families that blended two worlds. Strongholds were laboratories of possibility, where the old rules of empire and hierarchy were thrown out. And yet, the shadow of violence was never far away. Strongholds were also places of betrayal, drunken bloodshed, and brutal justice. Captains enforced discipline with the rope or the cutlass. Fights over loot ended in death. And of course, there was always the looming threat of execution. If the outside world caught up to them, pirate havens were both dreams and nightmares, paradise and prison. One of the more fascinating aspects of these bases is how they adapted to geography. Pirates were masters of using the land itself as a shield. In the Bahamas, shallow reefs and twisting inlets acted as natural barriers, keeping out large warships. In Madagascar, thick jungles and remote coves made pursuit nearly impossible. In the Caribbean, some strongholds were hidden behind walls of mangroves, invisible until you were practically inside. These weren't castles of stone, but fortresses of nature. Pirates knew they couldn't outgun the navies of Europe, but they could outsmart them, forcing their enemies into traps and dead ends. Still, geography alone could not save them. Because no matter how well hidden a stronghold was, it only took one slip a sailor captured and tortured into revealing a map. A spy planted by a governor, a traitor bought off with gold. Information was the weapon that destroyed pirate havens. The Empire's warships did not need to find every base. They only needed one loose tongue to point the way. Perhaps the greatest irony of pirate strongholds is that many were lost not to enemies, but to the sea itself. Hurricanes destroyed entire fleets in harbor, smashing ships against the rocks. Earthquakes swallowed cities like Port Royal. Plague swept through crowded quarters where rum was cheap but medicine scarce. Pirates could defy kings and governors, but they could not defy nature. And yet, their stories endure because for a moment, they succeeded. For a moment, men who were supposed to be crushed under the boots of empire carved out kingdoms of their own. Isn't that why the idea of a pirate stronghold still fascinates us today? We imagine hidden coves, secret maps, caves filled with treasure, and towns where no laws apply. It's a fantasy, but one born from very real places that once existed. Think about it. Port Royal, Nassau. Tortuga, these names are more famous today than many legitimate colonies of the time. Why? Because they represented something bigger. They were symbols of rebellion, proof that the powerless could fight back, even if only briefly. Empires built forts to last centuries. Pirates built havens to last years. Yet it's the pirate havens that live on in legend, while so many colonial outposts have been forgotten. There's also a darker lesson here. The fall of these strongholds was not just about pirates losing battles, it was about the triumph of order over chaos. The empires had to erase them, because if they didn't, the very idea of rebellion could spread. If Nassau had survived, imagine what it might have inspired. A republic of outlaws, thriving outside the reach of kings, could have become a model for other oppressed people. It was dangerous not just because it stole silver, but because it offered hope. And hope is far harder to kill than any ship. That's why the destruction of pirate strongholds was often theatrical. Executions were public, designed to terrify. Heads were placed on spikes at harbor entrances, a grisly warning to anyone dreaming of rebellion. Strongholds were not just destroyed. They were erased, their memory poisoned by stories of sin and chaos. And yet, here we are, centuries later, still telling their tales. It's worth pausing to ask, why do these outlaw havens still capture our imagination? Perhaps because they mirror a conflict we all feel, the tension between freedom and security. Pirate strongholds offered absolute freedom, but with it came danger, instability, and short lives. Empires offered security, but at the cost of obedience and control. The pirate base was freedom's extreme, a glimpse at what happens when rules are burned away. And though it failed, it still whispers to us, what if we dared to live outside the system? Of course, life inside these strongholds was not the romantic adventure of movies. Disease was rampant, food was scarce, water ran foul, violence was constant. The same captains who spoke of equality also ruled with terror when it suited them. For many pirates, these havens were not a paradise, but simply the lesser of two evils, better than starving on a naval ship. But far from utopia. The fantasy of a golden pirate republic is just that, a fantasy. But myths grow where truth leaves gaps, and pirate strongholds became myth almost as soon as they disappeared. Travelers spoke of hidden ports where treasure was piled high. Maps were forged showing coves that no one could ever find. Writers spun tales of underground vaults, cursed islands, and pirate kings who ruled in secret. The reality was usually far harsher: few ramshackle huts, a muddy harbor, a pile of stolen goods quickly squandered on rum. Still, the myth of the stronghold became as powerful as the truth. Even governments fed the legend, sometimes without meaning to. By painting pirate havens as dens of pure wickedness, they made them sound more mysterious, more dangerous, more alluring. The wickedest city on earth, the Pirate Republic, the Island of Outlaws, these names were meant to frighten, but instead they immortalized the strongholds forever. So perhaps the real legacy of pirate strongholds isn't in their physical ruins, most of which are gone, but in their stories. They became symbols in the cultural imagination, warnings, fantasies, and inspirations. And in that sense, they were never truly lost. we step back for a moment, there's something almost poetic about the rise and fall of these places. Built in desperation, fueled by greed, destroyed by betrayal or storm, they mirror the very lives of the pirates themselves. Short, violent, brilliant, and doomed. A pirate stronghold was not a monument of stone, was a reflection of the men who made it. And perhaps that's why we still talk about them, not because they lasted, but because they lived fiercely, if only for a moment. Even in their destruction, these places shaped history. The crackdown on pirate havens forced navies to grow stronger, trade routes to be protected, and colonial governance to tighten. In a strange way, the chaos of pirate strongholds helped birth the order of the modern world. And yet, beneath that order, the ghost of rebellion still lingers. Every time we tell a story of hidden treasure or a pirate republic, we echo the dream that once burned in those outlaw havens. The dream of freedom, no matter how fleeting. By the early 18th century, the age of pirate strongholds was closing like a trap. Empires were learning, adapting, and uniting against a common enemy. Where once a pirate could vanish into the maze of islands and reefs, now warships hunted them relentlessly, their sails blotting out the horizon. But even as the last havens fell, the story of these places was not overwrit, was just beginning to echo in legend. To understand the final downfall, we need to look at the shift in the world's balance of power. Empires were consolidating. Trade was no longer scattered or fragile. It was becoming organized, protected by powerful fleets. The same countries that once encouraged pirates as providers were now building stronger economies that could not afford disruption. Port Royal, Nassau, Tortuga, these strongholds were no longer tolerated because they had outlived their usefulness. The pirate had become a liability. Consider Port Royal. For decades, it thrived as a center of trade, vice, and piracy, tolerated by England so long as it undermined Spain. But when the earthquake struck in 1692, swallowing half the city into the sea, it was more than just a natural disaster. It was a symbolic turning point. Many saw it as divine judgment, and the English crown used the devastation as an excuse to clean up the city, replacing pirate patrons with loyal administrators. The pirate capital was never truly rebuilt to its former glory. The stronghold was dead, and the legend was born. Nassau followed a similar arc. Its pirate republic was a miracle of audacity, but miracles rarely last. When Woodes Rogers arrived with pardons and soldiers, he dismantled the republic piece by piece. Some pirates accepted forgiveness, others resisted and died. The experiment of self-governance was extinguished, but the memory of a place where outlaws ruled themselves lived on. To this day, the words Pirate Republic stir something in us, a mix of awe and envy. And then there was Madagascar, the faraway dream. For a brief moment, pirates imagined it as a utopia, a place where they could build a new life beyond Europe's reach. Some settled down, married locals, and planted roots. But roots require care, and pirates were restless by nature. Disease, conflict, and isolation gnawed away at the settlement. What could have been a lasting alternative to empire, instead collapsed into dust and memory. Here's the irony. The very qualities that made pirates successful at sea, their speed, their independence, their hunger for freedom, were the same qualities that doomed their strongholds. To build something lasting, you need patience, discipline, compromise. To live as a pirate, you need boldness, violence, and the refusal to bend. These two worlds could not coexist for long. The stronghold was always fated to crumble. Yet the collapse of these havens didn't erase their impact. In fact, their destruction may have amplified it. By tearing them down, empires turned them into symbols. A pirate stronghold was no longer just a physical place, became an idea, a story whispered across generations. And stories, as we know, often last longer than stone. Think about it. Today, we still talk about Port Royal, Tortuga, and Nassau. Their names appear in novels, films, and games. They're romanticized, exaggerated, sometimes entirely reinvented. But they remain alive. Meanwhile, how many people remember the dozens of legitimate colonial ports that were once considered important? Most have faded into obscurity. The pirates lost their havens, but they won immortality in myth. There's a strange kind of justice in that. The very men who were once condemned as outlaws and criminals stand taller in our imagination than the kings and governors who destroyed them. And their strongholds, though gone, still speak to us because they represent a universal desire, the longing to live outside the system, even if just for a fleeting moment. Of course, not all of what we remember is truth. The legends of vast treasure hoards buried beneath pirate bases are almost entirely fantasy. The idea of organized pirate kingdoms with thrones and crowns belongs more to novels than to history. In reality, most havens were rough, dirty, and constantly on the brink of collapse. But the myth has its own power. It tells us what people wanted to believe, that somewhere, hidden away, there once existed a place where the rules didn't apply, where the poor could rise, where freedom reigned. And maybe that's the final lesson of Pirate Strongholds. They remind us that freedom, in its purest form, is chaotic, unstable, and fleeting. You can't bottle it, you can't legislate it, you can't build walls around it. You can only live it in bursts, like sparks that flare against the night. The pirate strongholds were those sparks, brief, brilliant, and doomed. But in their failure, they showed us something eternal, that people will always dream of breaking chains, no matter how impossible it seems. Imagine for a moment being a sailor in 1715. You've been whipped by your captain, starved on long voyages, treated as less than human. And then you hear whispers of Nassau, a place where men like you have a voice, where treasure is divided fairly, where no king commands you. Wouldn't you be tempted to risk everything to reach it? Even knowing it might not last, even knowing it might end in fire and rope, the dream itself would be worth the gamble. That's the magnetism of the pirate stronghold. Not what it was, but what it promised. And maybe that's why they still haunt our imagination today. Because deep down, we all understand the trade they made. They chose freedom over security, danger over comfort, the moment over the future. It cost them everything, but it gave them lives that still echo centuries later. The empires that destroyed them may have won the war, but the pirates won something harder to kill: the myth of freedom. In the end, every stronghold, Port Royal, Tortuga, Nassau, Madagascar, followed the same arc. They rose quickly, burned brightly, and fell violently. But in those brief moments, they changed the course of history, forcing empires to adapt, reshaping trade and seeding stories that still inspire us. Their ruins may be gone, but their legacy remains etched in our culture, in every tale of treasure maps, hidden coves, and pirate kingdoms. And so, the story of pirate strongholds is not just about how they were built and lost. It's about why they mattered. They mattered because they showed us a world turned upside down, where the powerless could seize power, where rules could be rewritten, and where men could live free, if only for a heartbeat. They mattered because they remind us that even in the most controlled, ordered world, there will always be sparks of rebellion. Perhaps that's why we keep coming back to these stories. Not because we want to live like pirates, disease-ridden, hunted, violent, but because we crave that taste of freedom, that whisper of possibility. Pirate strongholds were doomed, yes. But in their doom lies their beauty. They were never meant to last forever. They were meant to remind us that freedom is fragile, dangerous, and worth everything. And maybe, in some way, that's the real treasure they left behind. Not gold, not jewels, not buried chests, but the enduring idea that another world is possible, if only for a moment. So the next time you hear the word Nassau or Tortuga or Port Royal, don't just think of drunken pirates and treasure maps. Think of what they really were: experiments in freedom, crushed by empires, but kept alive in legend. Sparks that burned against the darkness, and in burning, lit a fire that still flickers in our imagination today. Thank you for sailing with me through this hidden history. If you enjoyed this story and want to uncover more forgotten corners of the past, make sure to subscribe.